Provocations reached their peak in August when the submarine Delfino torpedoed and sank the HRN destroyer Eli. When on the 12th of October 1940 German troops entered Romania, Mussolini decided to act immediately, proclaiming October 26th as the day of the invasion. Although Il Duce was furious because Romania was in the Italian sphere of influence, the German interest in the Balkans prevented Turkey from coming to Greece's aid, and this allowed the dictator to declare war on them, either occupation or war. Metaxas answered with his famous Ochi, or no. 6 days later, some 140,000 men, under torrential rain, invaded Greece along a 90-mile front. They believed the invasion would be fast and would face around 36,000 Greeks, enjoying a 3-to-1 advantage against the defenders. To the surprise of the Italians, the political divisions in Greece were temporarily silenced in a mood of national unity as the Greeks swiftly mobilized reservists to the front lines. At that point, the Greek army fielded one fully mobilized infantry division in Epirus, the 8th Division, commanded by General Charalampos Katsimitros, while the 9th Division was placed at the Yugoslav border. They had no tanks and were low on machine guns and artillery. Supported by other formations, these divisions would have to hold the Italian advance until reinforcements arrived. Only the forces on the border with Bulgaria were not moved, as the Greeks feared the Bulgarians would invade and assist the Italians in their offensive. Visconti Prasca, on the other hand, planned to have Rossi's infantry attack the center of the defensive line, while the Centaro armored division advanced through the narrow valley of the Calamus River, attempting an encircling maneuver against their left wing. None of these units at first encountered any resistance, as Papagos approved an initial strategic withdrawal behind the Calamus River. On November 2nd, the weather improved and the Italians decided to attack the main defensive line. In response, the Lumba detachment had to retreat further south to protect the gateway to southern Greece. The deepest Italian advance came 1 day later when the coastal forces occupied the village of Margariti. By November 8th, however, the Italian offensive in Epirus had stopped. At the Pindus Mountains, another struggle was occurring at the same time. The Julia Division decisively defeated Davicus's small detachment by October 29th, and 4 days later got within 12 miles of the vital Metsovo Pass, capturing the city of Kanitsa and the villages of Samarina and Vavosa. But the Alpini were slowed down by the foul weather conditions and were forced to stop, calling for reinforcements that never came. Papagos realized the precarious situation on this front and sent reinforcements, including the 1st Division. On November 4th, General Vasileios Phraknos commanded this counteroffensive into the Battle of Pindus. He first occupied Mount Tamburi north of Samarina, then sent his cavalry in an encircling maneuver behind the town. Surrounded, the Julia sustained heavy casualties, but eventually managed to break out of the encirclement and started to retreat, calling for reinforcements. Later that day, Phraknos had managed to reoccupy Samarina and Vavousa, pressing his attack on the depleted Julia and completely defeating the Alpini division. Giroti was now trapped at the village of Distrato, and the Greeks were preparing for a dual attack aimed at dislodging them from the height of Gomara. On November 5th, the Greeks launched their decisive attack against the Julia. From the east, Greek cavalry was ordered to flank the Alpini positions and capture Gomara, while the 7th Battalion was tasked with capturing the western heights. 4 times the 7th's charge was repelled, but in the afternoon a 5th charge managed to expel the Julia from the heights. At the same time, the Greek cavalry secured a precarious foothold on Gomara, yet Giroti stubbornly clung to his position and threw every resource he had to stop the Greek advance. Yet on the following day, when the 7th moved to cut the only escape road back to Konitsa, the Italian commander realized he had been defeated. Although he continued to resist the relentless assaults of the Greek cavalry for another day, in the end the exhausted Julia division would have to retreat to Konitsa through the Pindus Mountains. Under constant artillery bombardment, the Julia fell back along the Aus River, putting up sporadic resistance during their withdrawal. When they finally reached Konitsa, the Julia division was not a proud elite division anymore, it was a battered and demoralized unit. As such, Visconti Prasca quickly decided to send them some reinforcements. Throughout December, reinforcements continued to pour in to support the retreating Italians, but they were coming too slowly. Soddu was demoralized and wanted an armistice to end the conflict with the Greeks. This angered Mussolini, who sacked Soddu and replaced him with Ugo Cavallero. Cavallero had carefully studied the situation and decided that it would be best to retreat to the Shkumbin River, a natural barrier that spans the width of Albania from the northern approaches of Pogradec in the east to the Adriatic Sea in the west. Frustratingly for the Italians, Cavallero's order to withdraw and reform at Shkumbin came after a series of valiant rearguard actions that gave the Greeks considerable trouble. Though the Greeks had taken Permet on December 3rd, the Italian line of defence across the Kalsura Valley was getting stronger. As the 10th and 11th Divisions braced to try and break the line, further to the west the 1st Corps was making slow progress from Kakavia up the Drina Valley along a hugely extended front of 40 miles. It was easier going along the coast, but the Greek advance was brought almost to a halt by bitter fighting on the road to Agira Castro. Along that road stood Hill 669, a strategic height coveted by the Greeks. On the other hand, Papagos had no other intention than to keep advancing. On December 28th, Metaxas managed to convince Papagos. The Greek objective was now to consolidate the supply and communications lines, while the 2nd Corps prepared for an offensive to capture the Kalsura Valley. 15th Division defeated the Wolves of Tuscany, and the 1st and 11th started a counter-offensive against the Kalsura Valley. In just 5 days, and with the reinforcement of the Cretan 5th Division, the strategic Klesura Pass fell and the Kalsura Valley was secured. By January 25th, the 2nd Corps' mission had been achieved with the occupation of the Trebishina mountain range. 2 days later, Rossi's 25th Corps counterattacked and expelled the Greek forces on the Trebishina mountains. The Cretan 5th managed to hold the Italians and repulsed the attack by January 29th. After a hard-fought struggle, the Cretans captured Trebishina on February 2nd. In the following weeks, this division repulsed several Italian attacks trying to dislodge them from the mountain, even under the deadly frozen weather of Trebishina. By the 17th of February, the Greeks had captured the mountain ranges, but it was a costly victory, particularly for the Cretan division, which suffered 5,000 casualties. Greek morale suffered a heavy blow after the death of Metaxas on January 29th. It was certain that the Germans would attack through Bulgaria, and Papagos decided to reorganize his forces to meet this new threat, transferring many divisions back to the Bulgarian border. The British sent the W Expeditionary Force under General Sir Henry Wilson. This force was composed of the 1st Armoured Brigade, led by Brigadier Harold Charrington, the 2nd New Zealand Division under General Bernard Freyberg, and the 6th Australian Division, commanded by General Sir Ivan Mackay. By March 21st, Charrington and Freyberg had got their men up to the Alikmon River. This second line extended east of the town of Florina, passing through Edessa all the way to the north of Mount Olympus and the coast of Katerini. Although Papagos didn't want to forsake Salonika, the Greeks supported them with the Central Macedonia Army Section, composed of the 12th and 20th Divisions. Not willing to lose an Axis member, Hitler adjusted the plans of Operation Marita to also include the invasion of Yugoslavia. Many forces of the German 12th Army were redirected against the Yugoslavian-Bulgarian border, while the rest of the army would storm the Metaxas line. The plan was to overrun southern Yugoslavia, to outflank the Metaxas line and encircle the Greeks. There was a weak spot on the left of the Metaxas line, Mount Belis, where the borders of Greece, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria met. If breached, the Germans could be in Salonika in hours, cutting off the forces in the east. Furthermore, if the Monastir Pass fell to the Germans, the Greek army in Albania would be trapped and would have to surrender. For this reason, the possession of Monastir and the Axios Valley was essential. The 12th Army of Field Marshal Wilhelm List was divided into 3 army corps, comprising 5 armoured panzer divisions, including 3 SS regiments of the Adolf Hitler Panzer Division under Josef Diedrich, 2 motorized divisions, 3 light mountain divisions, and some infantry divisions, with over 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft and 1,900 heavy tanks against Wilson's 176 tanks and 45 aircraft. By April 5th, these forces had been successfully assembled. At 5:15 AM on April 6th, the Germans declared war on Greece. At the same time, the invasion of Yugoslavia started with the bombing of Belgrade. List's motorized artillery began their bombardment of Fort Rupel and the adjacent forts. The 18th Mountain Corps, under General Franz Böhmer, was tasked with assaulting the bulk of the Metaxas line at Rupel, while the 30th Corps of General Otto Hartmann had to advance towards the Turkish border and outflank the easternmost forts. Meanwhile, General Georg Stürmer's 40th Panzer Corps was commanded to storm southern Yugoslavia and take the key positions of Monastir and Strumica. Böhmer's 125th Regiment was the first to assault the Metaxas line. In the west, Stürmer sent the 73rd Division to capture Prilep, thus isolating Yugoslavia from its allies, and the 2nd Panzer Division to capture Strumica and outflank the Metaxas line. The panzers encountered little resistance and managed to occupy Strumica on the same day. In response, Lumbas shielded the town of Kilkis to avoid encirclement. On April 7th, the assaults on Fort Rupel resumed. The Germans were repelled again, but they managed to infiltrate positions around the fort and pinned down where the Greek guns were. To the west, the 2nd Panzer Division enjoyed much more success, as they repelled a Yugoslav counterattack and forced their way across the mountains, overrunning the thinly manned defensive line of Lumbas's forces south of Lake Doiran. Lumbas was forced to retreat, and Kilkis was occupied by the panzers, who continued south towards Salonika. In result, the Metaxas line had been completely cut off from the rest of the Greek defences. Akopolos continued to resist, but his forces were exhausted. One day later, Salonika fell and Akopolos was forced to ask for a truce, which List accepted. The Wehrmacht would allow all captured Greek officers to keep their sidearms, and pledged that none of them would be sent to a concentration camp. The battle for Fort Rupel had cost the Germans more than 300 killed against 56 Greeks. But the majority of the Greek defences were gone, and now the only one that could stop the German advance was Wilson. On the Albanian front, the Greeks launched the joint offensive with the Yugoslavians against the Italian forces, aiming to advance into Durazzo and Valona. Initially it went well, but after the fall of Skopje on April 7th, the Yugoslavians were knocked out of the fight. General Gorgios Salakoglu, the commander of the Epirus army, kept advancing and fighting for a few days, but by April 10th the news of the fall of Salonika forced them to stop the offensive and consider retreat. On April 15th, the Greeks started their withdrawal from the Albanian front, and by April 20th they reached Greek soil again. The progress of a 5-month campaign had been undone in just 2 weeks. In Greece, the political and military establishments were struck by a defeatist paralysis. Even Papagos knew that the country was going to be occupied, and that he would be captured with the rest of his army. In Aliakmon, Wilson prepared his forces to hold the line, hoping that the forces in Albania would come to his aid. By April 8th, Prilep had fallen to the 73rd Division, and Stürmer's forces prepared to advance towards Monastir. The 9th Panzer Division defeated the Greeks defending the Monastir Valley, and rallied for an offensive towards Kozani. The objective of the attack was to encircle Salakoglu's forces in Albania and the British at the Aliakmon line, and thus prevent both of them from linking up. At this point, Wilson's forces in Aliakmon were starting an organised withdrawal to a new defensive position on Mount Olympus. Mackay's forces were charged with the defence of the key Klidi Pass, linking the towns of Vevi and Klidi, and had to gain as much time as possible. The 9th, reinforced with the SS Adolf Hitler Regiment, took Vevi on April 11th and launched the attack on Klidi the following day, using the same blitzkrieg strategy that had devastated France and Yugoslavia. The panzer units launching a pursuit along the road made slow progress because of the steep gradient and a large number of difficult hairpin bends. But from Lamia, Burma had sent a motorcycle battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division to cross to the island of Euboea and seize the port of Chalcis. Now he commanded this battalion to outflank the British last stand and capture Athens. The motorcycle troops encountered only slight resistance, and on the morning of April 27th, the first Germans entered Athens. The Athenians had been expecting the Germans for several days, and confined themselves to their homes with their windows shut. The fall of Greece was now an established fact, with the Germans raising the Nazi flag on the Acropolis, and hostilities ceased, thus ending the invasion. The British successfully completed the evacuation of about 50,000 soldiers to Crete, but in their hasty retreat, they lost 11,840 men. The loss of Greece was a tough one for the Allies. The Greeks had inspired the democratic world with their resistance against the Italian invaders, even earning the respect of the unstoppable Germans. The British, having guaranteed their Greek allies against the Italian threat, quickly moved to reinforce the island of Crete with the 14th Infantry Brigade, mainly at Suda Bay. Brigadier Brian Chappell was placed in command of this unit to defend the island. For the British, control of Crete was of the utmost importance, since it gave them an ideal place to maintain their naval and air superiority in the eastern Mediterranean. Student started using Juncker's Ju-87 Stuka bombers to disrupt the sea power of the British fleet and to carry out air raids on British airfields. Meanwhile, he prepared his men for the upcoming offensive. It started with the 7th Air Corps performing a series of concentrated attacks on the British defensive positions, followed by Student's first wave of gliders and paratroopers. Group West was the first to land, with 3 companies landing near Malmö. Then landed 2 companies from Group Center, 1 near Galatas and 1 more at the Akrotiri Peninsula. In response, the low-altitude machine guns and anti-aircraft guns of the defenders fired ceaselessly to keep the paratroopers pinned down. To the south and east of the Malmö airfield, as well as on the Akrotiri Peninsula, the Germans were swiftly dealt with and practically wiped out. The paratroopers suffered massive casualties against the British barrage, and General Meindl himself was seriously wounded within an hour of landing. But at Heraklion, Group East had lost 1/3 of their forces and were now on the defensive. Realizing the failure of his plan, Student decided to concentrate his remaining forces on supporting the attack against Malmö. On May 21st, Vassi's forces launched a counterattack against the Germans at Rethymnon, but the paratroopers held firm. Meanwhile, Student sent the devastating Stukas to bombard Malmö, Rethymnon and Heraklion in preparation for a renewed attack. Group East and Center were ordered to hold their ground in a defensive position, while Student dropped 550 paratroopers at Tefrontis to reinforce Group West. This convoy of 38 Kaikis, escorted by the Italian destroyer Sagittario, was directed towards Heraklion. The heroic actions of the Sagittario, laying a smokescreen under concentrated fire, managed to save the flotilla and return to Greece unharmed. Furthermore, the British Navy was under unremitting bombardment, losing 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers in the process, and Admiral King ordered Force A to reinforce Force C in the Aegean Sea. This was a mistake, as the 2 forces were now easy prey for the Luftwaffe. Warspite and Valiant were both hit by bombs, while the destroyer Greyhound and the cruisers Gloucester and Fiji were sunk. The naval forces would be reinforced by the 5th Destroyer Flotilla coming from Malta, consisting of 5 destroyers under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten on the Kelly. But these reinforcements too would be assaulted by the Stukas, which succeeded at sinking the destroyers Kashmir and Kelly. Mountbatten and his crew, however, would be saved by the destroyer Kipling, immediately retreating back to Alexandria with his flotilla. Overall, these heavy losses forced the British fleet to vacate the area around Crete and leave the island on May 23rd, consolidating the triumph of the Luftwaffe over the British Navy. Student decided to launch a new wave of drops over Colonel Brower's whereabouts. 4 companies of paratroopers were taken from Malmö on May 28th to reinforce Group East. Furthermore, an Italian regiment of about 3,000 men would make a naval landing at the town of Sitja by midday, which would then continue to advance through the eastern end of the island. On May 27th, Ringel's main offensive was launched. From Heraklion, some 4,000 men of Chapel's brigade were transported by Force B under heavy aerial attack. The reinforced German paratroopers then assaulted the city on May 29th, but couldn't stop the garrison from escaping. The following day, the Greek forces at Rethymnon were evacuated, while the Australians remained to defend the city. Group Centre received ample reinforcements, including several panzers, and in the end, Rethymnon fell when Colonel Ian Campbell, left in command of the Australian forces, was forced to surrender at night. Throughout the battle, the Cretan population had aided the British in their struggle against the invaders, fighting with whatever weapons they could gather. Once the island had been occupied, Student ordered the execution of a series of collective punishments against the civilians, with more than 500 inhabitants being massacred. After the war, the German general managed to avoid prosecution for the war crimes he committed. Hitler's airborne gamble had been a success, but it wasn't the success he expected. The Germans had suffered massive casualties, almost 6,000 of them, and lost a significant amount of aircraft. The Führer was so aghast by this that he discounted any future use of airborne troops on such a grand scale. The Fallschirmjäger would then be reformed to act as normal land soldiers in future operations, such as Barbarossa.